Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this adorable set of 24 Christmas minis. So first up we have the Santa. For this entire set I am doing a one consistency outline and flood. I always do this for minis. One consistency outline and flood means I'm using the same consistency as you can see here to both outline and flood a cookie. I'm using a pretty thick flood consistency, which means that sometimes I need to use a scribe to help it settle. In a second, I'll be using black pearls to use for his eyes, and I'm going to use those black pearls for all eyes for all of the animals and little humans in this set. And I'm doing that mostly out of ease. It's a lot easier than piping them. The only black pearls I use are by PME. Don't use any other brand, they will bleed. I'll link them in the description of this video. And here I am after I let the red and the brown crust. I am now using a medium peak piping consistency to pipe the rest of the hat and the beard. What I'm doing with the beard is this kind of pressure piping thing. It's like I'm piping dots, but I'm connecting them by allowing the icing to still come out. So it's like pressure, release, drag, and that's how it kind of connects all of them together. So it's like messy dots. It's easy. It's a lot easier than it sounds, I promise. And I'm using the same consistency here for the whiskers and the eyebrows. That nose was a soft peak piping consistency. And that is the Santa. Up next we have the first ornament of the set. And for this, I am doing wet on wet. Wet on wet is easy in some ways, but it's hard because you have to move very quickly before the icing starts to crust. This design is pretty simple. I'm not doing a lot of extra icing with the wet on wet, so I don't need to be too careful about under flooding this cookie. Normally when I'm doing wet on wet, I will under flood the base to make sure that once I add more icing from the wet on wet design, that I'm not adding so much icing that it will just fall over the edge. Wet on wet is probably my favorite technique. There's so much you can do with it. It can be very simple, but so effective. So I am first piping alternating lines here. This is also flood consistency. You need to make sure for wet on wet that your consistencies are the same. If they are too different, too thin of a flood, too thick of a flood, they won't settle flat into each other. And I'm using a scribe here. This is probably the easiest thing you can do for wet on wet is this one continuous pull. And the reason why that's easier is that first of all, you don't have to pull your scribe out and possibly clean it off every time. And it goes a lot faster since you don't have to do that. So there's a little less worry about it taking too long and the icing crusting over. Now, just for the video here, I didn't wait for the blue to crust over, and I'm doing piping consistency here with the gray. But for all the other cookies, I did let the blue actually crust before I piped the gray on top. Up next, we have the Christmas light. Very simple, very effective cookie here. I am outlining and flooding. My flood consistency here is on the thicker side, so I have a thin and a thick flood. The way that I measure the thickness of flood is how it falls off the spoon when you pick it up from the bowl. For a thick flood, it will just barely stream off of the spoon. If it's a thin flood, it's a fast continuous stream off of the spoon. If you're doing seconds for a thick flood, it's somewhere in the region of a 20-second flood. I'm using a scribe here on this flood, not because it needs it to settle, but because my icing started to separate, which is especially common with darker colors. So I was using that scribe to just kind of help all of the color settle into each other so I didn't get those streaks in the icing when it dries. And this is just a little wet on wet dimension here. And again, I'm going in and I'm piping the gray while it's still wet, just for the video, but for all the other cookies, I did actually let the red crust before I moved on. But since the gray is piping consistency, it still maintained definition in between the two sections. Up next, we have the star. For this, I'm doing a somewhat new to me technique, which is to use parchment paper on top of the wet cookie. Later, I will show you what it looks like to use flat parchment paper. For this one, we're using crinkled. I like to crinkle it twice. I crinkle it once in my hand, open it up, turn it inside out, and crinkle it the other way. You can crinkle it as much or as little as you want. It's totally up to you how much dimension you want. After I flood this, I'm also going to add just a little extra sparkle with the Sugar Art Diamond Dust in gold. I just want a little extra something. Keep in mind that most of the glitter out there is not actually edible. This is completely edible glitter. It's amazing. I highly recommend. I will link it in the description of the video. And while this is still wet, something important here is you see I didn't flood all the way to the edge because I'm pressing down here and I am going to press the icing out a little bit. So do yourself a favor, don't flood all the way to the edge. And when I press down here, I like to press from the center out. Sometimes you'll get air bubbles if you don't give total contact, which I think is totally fine because that's just the technique. This is completely dried. I let it dry overnight. It will be very easy to take off if the icing is totally dry. You can see that little extra sparkle there. And up next we have the gingerbread house. For the door, I am piping this with a medium peak piping consistency, which is, in my opinion, not ideal. I would have preferred a soft peak, but this is better than not. I don't want to use flood consistency here because it would absolutely crater in such a small space. The thicker the icing you use, the less likely you will get craters. So this is so thick that I absolutely need a scribe to help it settle. And then again, purely for the video, I have gone in and just immediately piped and outlined and flood the rest of the cookie. Since the blue is such a thick consistency, it will still maintain definition in between the blue and the brown. That was my goal here. I wanted there to be definition in between the door and the rest of the house. It's really important before the next step, which is adding the snow, that you allow the brown and blue icing to really sufficiently crust, because if it's still a little humid, a little wet at all, these sprinkles will definitely adhere to the brown icing, which is not what you want. So I will put it in the dehydrator for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. If you don't have a dehydrator, in front of a fan for maybe 30 minutes till it looks like what you can see here. So I'm piping here with a medium peak piping consistency. You could definitely use a soft peak. I prefer to apply sprinkles with a piping consistency because I feel like sprinkles, they really, they apply pressure to an icing, so they spread it out. And if your icing is too thin, then you will get sprinkles on the side of your cookie, which has definitely happened to me many, many times. A lesson learned. You need to work pretty quickly the thicker your icing when you're using sprinkles, because it will start to crust, and if it starts to crust, then the sprinkles will not adhere. This is my favorite method for applying sprinkles. Put it over a bowl, use a spoon, tap it off, and there we go. Now I can pipe the rest of the details. This is all piping consistency, more like, I would say, somewhere between a soft and a medium peak. I'm piping this wreath kind of like how I did the Santa's beard, where I'm piping like a dot and then dragging to the next one, so it appears to be joined together. Finishing the wreath up with some holly berries and then some pressure piped hearts, just because it's cute and why not. And that, my friends, is the gingerbread house. Up next, we have the tree. This is going to be another wet on wet design. There's a bit more icing that will be added for this one, so I would recommend underflooding ever so slightly if you're afraid of the icing overflooding. It has taken me a lot of practice to get to a point where I can do a one consistency outline and flood all the way to the edge of the cookie. I still, every once in a while, will have a spillover, but usually that's because I'm a little overzealous with the amount of pressure I'm applying. Every time, you really just need to get a sense of the consistency of your icing and therefore how much pressure you can apply and how much icing you can apply to your surface. And here I am dragging. This is also a flood consistency white. It's really important to pull the bag off the surface so you get some nice lines. This is a simple drag through for wet on wet. I let that crust, and then I'm piping a cute little pressure piped heart as a detail. And that is the tree. Up next, we have the first snowflake in this set. And for this one, I'm doing a pressure piped design. This is this classic teardrop shape where you're piping a dot, essentially, applying a lot of pressure and then releasing the pressure as you're dragging the bag away from the dot. So that's what creates the increased pressure and then less. You don't want to pull away until you have a sufficient kind of peak and dot to your shape, because that's not going to change once you pull away. I'm using a swivel here just to make it easier, so I'm piping everything at the exact same angle. I find particularly with this kind of pressure piping that I really can only do this well from one angle. So with a design like this, I definitely want to use a swivel, otherwise I'm constantly turning the cookie, which is just kind of annoying. I love this swivel. It is from LC Sweets, and I will link this in the description of the video. Once I'm done piping this, I'm going to take my tweezers and add just a couple of sprinkles to the middle to finish it off. I love these tweezers. I will also link them in the description of this video. Oh, sprinkle down. I went to go fetch it. There we go. And then I add some of the white diamond dust from the Sugar Art. Love this stuff. Love the extra sparkle that it gives. And there we have it. Up next is the elf. Unfortunately, I seem to have forgotten to film the first part of his face, but it's standard outline and flood. It doesn't matter if there's definition in between the yellow and green or not. And again, I'm using those black pearls from PME. This is another pressure piped detail, piping a bead, releasing pressure and pulling away. This is medium peak, same as the Santa's hat and beard. And I like that this doesn't completely settle on the elf's hat. I like that texture that it gives. Here is his collar. And then I allow that face to almost completely dry because you want to make sure that you don't poke a hole in the face with those cheeks and the pen that I'm going to use in a second. This is all edible. I will link the pen and the cheeks. And that is the elf. Up next we have the snow globe. This is a pretty simple start here with an outline and flood. I'm going to be adding some sprinkles as some easy snow. That's my favorite way to do snow on a snow globe, or sprinkles. You can also pipe them either wet on wet or pipe them after when the base has dried for some 3D dimension. Just a little bit goes a long way. And then I'm piping this base. Again, this same softish, medium-ish peak piping consistency. Once that blue has crusted over, I'm going in with this medium peak piping consistency for the snowman. You could do something a little thinner, like a soft peak for this, but I kind of liked the texture on the snowman. And then while that is still wet, I'm piping the nose. And I decided later to add a hat and a scarf, which is what I'm doing now. This is all piping consistency. Adding a little scarf. It's super important that this snowman be almost completely dry, if not completely dry, before I do this writing like you see here. Otherwise, you're going to poke right through the surface of the icing with this pen. And that is the adorable snow globe. And up next, this is actually supposed to be a tag, but I don't make it look too tag-like. You could add a circle cutout in the center and obviously have to do a different technique than what I did. I'm using parchment paper for this one. This time it will be flat parchment paper. As you can see, I'm not flooding all the way to the edge of the cookie. That's very intentional. When I put the parchment paper on top, it's going to flatten a bit. It's important to, of course, put the parchment paper on while the icing is still wet. With this technique, if you don't completely press on the surface of the icing, you may get some air bubbles, which I think is completely fine. I just think that's part of this technique and I think it looks cool. But if you don't want the air bubbles, just extra make sure that you're pressing the whole surface. I like to go from the inside out to prevent air bubbles. Now let that dry overnight completely before you peel it off. And here I am writing with that pen again. Kind of wish I had used a projector to make it look a little neater, but didn't quite have the patience for a projector on this one. And I'm okay with it. Not every cookie needs to look like a machine did it. It is a handcrafted art, and it's okay. So here's a little holly that I'm piping with somewhere closer to a soft peak at this point. Just the little details. Nothing crazy to make it look a little more festive. My goal here was to make it look kind of like brown paper, and I think I succeeded. So that is the Merry Christmas tag. You can see that air bubble right in the center there. And up next we have the stocking. For this one, I'm going to be painting a detail on top. So I'll want to make sure that this icing has a pretty decent crust to it, so I'm not painting through the surface of the icing. Give it a little jiggle because the icing is on the thicker side. So I'm using an edible paint here. And I was going for a gingham look, which means that it's this crisscross, but the sections where the lines connect are darker, and I didn't realize when I embarked on using the paint that I wouldn't quite get that effect, that it would all just look the same. It still looks great, but next time I do this technique, I will use food gel coloring instead. That will give me the layered look that I'm going for. You can see here it all pretty much just looks the same. And that is the stocking. Up next is this present, and this will be another wet on wet design. A lot of people tend to be pretty amazed with my ability to freehand eye lines, relatively straight lines. And I think it's partly my control of the bag, but also just my ability to kind of guide the icing. So that's all I've got for you right now, but maybe I'll have some more thoughts later. There'll be a lot more wet on wet lines in the plaid tag. So this here is piping consistency. It's a medium peak, which is a little on the thin side for this here, but it worked. It's good enough. That's something I've learned with cookie decorating, is sometimes and often you just need to work with what you have. So maybe it's a little too thick or a little too thin, and if you need to, you can rebag the icing, but if it's a small detail, work with what you've got. So I'm just using the tip of the bag here to kind of help it settle a little bit. And then I'm piping some more lines. As details, is the same icing, the same medium peak piping consistency. I'm adding this little pressure piped heart here, which I do on a handful of the cookies in this set, and I think it's just one design element that kind of helps pull such a large set together. Up next is the sweater mitten. I'll be doing the now very widely used and kind of famous sweater technique on this cookie. I have just barely allowed this icing to crust. If you're pretty confident with your piping skills, you don't need to make sure that the icing has a huge crust on it. The more confident you are, then the less likely you are to puncture the icing. It's really about just laying it on top. So I left in this mistake here so you can see that my piping isn't always perfect. And I had a kind of false start on that line, and no biggie. Just wipe it off and start over, and no one will know. This is the part that really makes it look like a knit texture. And again, this is that pressure piping technique that I've used before, where kind of pipe a bead with a lot of pressure and then release pressure as I pull away. This is a medium peak piping consistency, which just allows it to hold its shape pretty well. And I'm just doing these kind of swirls just to give it some continuity and texture. And that is the mitten. Up next, we have the adorable little gingerbread man. Adding these PME pearls with these tweezers. I'll link these tweezers. They're awesome. They're actually cooking tweezers. I allow that to crust over, and I'm using this pressure piped heart again a design element that is throughout this set. It's really important, I think, with such large sets to have a couple of design elements that carry through the entire set. Of course, colors is an easy thing to do. Something like these hearts. Here I am going to do the cheeks with this edible dust. I will link that as well. And on the design elements, other things you'll see a lot in this set are wet on wet lines and just lines in general. I have a couple of holly accents that carry a few times through this set. And that's the little gingerbread man. Up next, this is the second ornament of the set, and it will also be a wet on wet design. And this design is a little more difficult than the last one. It requires you to pull out your scribe, clean it quite a few times, have to work pretty quickly, but it's super fun and super effective. So first up, I'm piping the lines. Yes, this is me moving pretty quickly. So with this pull technique, I'm cleaning off my scribe in between every pull. If I didn't do that, you would see some red and white and green icing in the pulls, so it wouldn't be as clean as it looks right now. It's certainly, there's a time and a place not to clean off your scribe in between. This was just not it. So at the end of the pulls, I'm just adding a little dot. Just a little something extra. And then I'm using a scribe to help them settle. Sometimes you need to do this at the end of a wet on wet design because it's crusted over a bit and it just needs help settling. And you can use that with a scribe, just the very surface of the icing, just help it kind of jiggle in. Piping consistency again for the top. And that is the second ornament. Up next is the mug. Is it coffee? Is it hot chocolate? I'm not sure. I'll let you decide. So I let that first part crust over to make sure I get definition in between the heart of the mug and the handle. I'll admit here that my icing was thicker than I would have liked. It's more like a medium peak. It would have been much better as a soft peak, and if I had more patience, I would have spent more time helping it settle out with a scribe. But if you've watched enough of my videos, you know that my patience only goes so far. So this was a This is good enough moment. Sometimes you just have to let it be good enough. As my uncle who works for the government says, good enough for government. So this is flood consistency here with the coffee, hot chocolate, whatever it is. And I allow that to crust over. Again, this base of the mug is very well crusted, if not completely dry, before I do this next part. It is very hard to write freehand with a marker on a cookie. There is no room for error at all. So here's that little heart motif design element that I'm carrying through. And then a little bit of whipped cream on the top, because why not? And that is the mug of chocolate liquid. Up next, we have this tag. Yes, it is a tag. I didn't do the best job, again, at making this look like a tag. If you wanted to make it look more like a tag, add a cutout circle at the top, or just leave it like I did and make it a little more interpretive, which is fine too. So for this design, I'm doing wet on wet plaid, which totally has my heart, but believe me, this takes some practice and you have to work very quickly. It's a lot of lines that you're piping, which tend to take more time. And I like to get a really nice layered plaid look, so I make my life harder and I switch bags maybe a little more often than I should. But here we are. So using my scribe to help this settle just a little bit more, I'm using this swivel. I don't use swivels a lot, but I really wanted to with this design, so that I could always get the perfect angle for my lines. I'm always piping in the same direction, which is one trick for myself to make sure that I'm getting the straightest lines possible. Yes, I always freehand draw my lines, or I should say pipe my lines. I'm not sure what it is exactly about my ability to pipe lines that's so straight, if I'm being totally honest here. I'm always pulling up my bag ever so slightly, as you can see here. I really guide my icing with my bag. I move relatively quickly to get the lines across, which I think helps with making them straight too. And you can see here with this beautiful layered look of the plaid, I'm then going to come in with the green in the center again. Now, if you needed to work a little bit faster, you could pipe all of the green first and then pipe the red, but I just love how it looks. So I put myself through the little extra misery to get this layered look. And last but not least, I'm piping these yellow lines on top for another added layer of layers. And I love it. So that is the plaid wet on wet tag. Up next, we have the adorable little reindeer. You could call him Rudolph if you want. He does have a red nose. So first up, I am outlining and flooding his face. And again, I'll be using those black PME pearls for his eyes. It's just the easiest thing to do. It's my favorite. It is a little hard to place them, I will say. And they're not all exactly the same size, so sometimes it's good to just eye which ones are the same before you place them. And I am using tweezers here, which is super essential. I used to put these on with just my fingers, and that's just a nightmare unto itself. So I have let the face crust, and then I'm going in. This is soft peak piping consistency here to pipe in the details. using that Cecilia Rose again on the cheeks. Again, make sure you do this when the icing is basically dry. Again, with the mouth. You don't want to poke through your icing. Do yourself a favor. So there's the reindeer. And up next is this super simple hat. This white icing is on the thicker side, which I actually kind of like that it doesn't totally soften out. Gives it some nice little poof texture on the top. And you see that heart again. So for this bell, I'm actually going to do this entire bell in one take. There's a lot of dimension here, but I don't let anything dry in between. So it's pretty amazing that there's really definition in between all these sections. So that was piping consistency that I piped on there, and I'm just using a brush to not so neatly brush it on. And this here is piping consistency, just outlining the opening of the bell and putting the little belly thing, what's that called? And then this is flood consistency. I am about to sprinkle here more of that white diamond dust for a little extra shine. And then after this, I'm going to go through with the piping consistency again. And that's why it's able to maintain some definition, because they're different consistencies. And that is the bell. Up next is the snowman. I'll be doing some flooding in sections here, which means that I flood a section or flood alternate sections, allow that to dry, and then flood the next one so that I can get definition. If you flood two sections next to each other, they will bleed into it, not bleed, but they will not have a seam in between the colors. And if you want that, that's great. But if you want definition and an actual valley in between, allow that first section to crust, like you can see that I've done here. And now I'm going in with the flood consistency. Again, using my scribe here because even my white had started to separate just a little bit. Wanted to encourage the icing to kind of blend together a little bit better. Using these beautiful tweezers for my black pearls. Sometimes I find it actually hard to place the eyes. I kind of stress out. Sometimes I do like to pipe them better because then I can place the eyes afterwards. But here we are. This is piping consistency. Keeps the definition in the little nose. Traditionally, yes, this would be orange, but I wasn't making orange for this set, so I thought yellow was close enough. And with those little details, that is the snowman. Up next is this candy cane. Basically just a wet on wet design with some lines. Y'all are a pro at this point. This is a lot of lines to pipe, so I am going to take a scribe in a second, and these last few lines I can tell aren't quite settling in, so just giving them a little extra encouragement. I allow that to crust, and then I do this pressure piped heart. And that is the candy cane. Up next, we have the other snowflake in this design. And for this one, I'm going to outline and flood the base of the cookie first. And then I'll do my design on top once this has crusted over nicely. So for this, I'm using piping consistency to pipe the design, and I'm going to cover this with sanding sugar sprinkles, which there's a very specific one that I like, and I will link it in the description of the video. It's the smallest grain that I've found commonly, and it's almost a little reflective and has a nice shine to it. It's a Wilton brand, my favorite. So for this kind of thing, you also need to work pretty quickly because, again, if this icing crusts over, then your little sprinkles are not going to adhere to the icing. And that is the snowflake. Last but not least is this little holly cookie. While the green is still wet, you can see that I'm piping the berries. This is a soft peak piping consistency with a little bit of jiggling from the end of the bag. It kind of settles out nicely, but I will take a scribe and just help that settle a little bit. And then once this crusts over, I pipe the final details. And here I got a little clog in my bag. So I thought I cleared it first time. Oh, didn't clear it, so I tried again. To remove a clog, I usually just squeeze out with my fingers the bottom 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 an inch of icing, depending on how bad the clog is. And that is the holly. And that is the entire set of 24 minis. Hope y'all have fun making these yourself.